Our first two talks today have gone over kind of a broad range of areas and given you lots of good information. We're going to really narrow it down here and really spend time just on one area, looking at BMR in transition cows. So it's going to be much more specific type of a presentation here. And let me give you a little background here. I'm going to go over all of the BMR transition cow work that's been done in the U.S. that I'm aware of. Okay, so it's going to be a long presentation. I know we only have a few hours left here, but I think I can get through it here. But this is the first trial, and this was done by Larry Satter's group. Another Santo was here, Lehman. But it was Larry Satter's group that did the study. And it was done at the USDA Forage Research Center. And it appeared in a USDA Forage Center research write-up and in a JDS abstract. And there's a little bit more information between these two different abstracts is really all that they were. And basically what they did was to feed cows either conventional corn silage, full corn silage, or BMR corn silage in the pre-fresh time period, and they kept them on that same corn silage in a post-fresh time period, or kept them on BMR. And they had a relatively long post-fresh group, 4 to 5 weeks in that post-fresh group. Afterwards, they all went on a common diet. And between these two abstracts, someone suggested, geez, how do they do production-wise after they came off of the study? And they said, well, you know what, we're not really sure. We'll go back and we'll analyze that data. And they did that too. And what they found was that the multi-pairous cows fed the BMR corn silage, again, only during this transition period, produced about 2 kilos more milk during week 6 to 15. And that was significant, as you can see at this p-value, just less than 0.09. And I remember reading that, and I thought, man, that's interesting. Why the heck was that? And is it real or not? So that's one study that's with BMR in transition cows. And then this is another one. This is by Mike Allen's group, and it's only 31 cows, and also I should point out just an abstract here as well. But 31 cows assigned 4-week prepartum to BMR or its isogenic control, 33% NDF, 14% crude protein, pre-fresh diet, 57% corn silage. Only 23 cows were on a treatment diet for at least 3 weeks and were included in the statistical analyses. And then all cows are switched to a common diet at freshening for 56 days, 28% NDF, 19% crude protein. Okay? In this study, BMR corn silage significantly increased digestibility of NDF, 43 versus 34. We saw earlier often a 12-point increase, and there's an 11-point increase. That was highly significant. No differences in dry matter intake or digestible dry matter intake before or after calving when they were fed BMR in this manner. No differences in production for those first 56 days. Okay? How many of you guys make your pre-fresh groups now so they were at 33% NDF? Right? So this is how the industry was often doing it at that time when this trial was done. This is early 2000s. But that's one thing to really remember about this study. Feed intake was definitely not limited by any aspect of fill before calving. The diet was formulated again for only 33% NDF. So there's 2 of the BMR transition trials that I'm aware of. Here is another one. This is also by Mike Allen, essentially Mike Allen's group. Richard Lunguski is Mike's research assistant. And this was Richard Lunguski's master's thesis. And one thing really neat about, I think really neat about the Michigan work is that they really tried to do this all the time. It's BMR or it's isogenic control. They try to, as much as they possibly could, control any other variation that potentially was going on there. And obviously that's a great thing to try to do in your research. This study, cows came off of a Dave Beatty anionic study. So there's cows on multiple different anionic programs, but they're blocked by these different treatments before freshening, and they're going on to either BMR or isogenic control at freshening. Okay? So we're starting BMR at freshening. For the first 50 days in milk, we've got our BMR cows, 1,779 kilograms. The isogenic control corn silage, only, 20-some kilograms less. Of course, that's not any significant effect. Cows at peak intake, 50 to 150 days in milk, now we've got a few hundred kilos. That was highly significant. And later in lactation, as you can see, a numeric increase, but not significant. And if any of you have heard Mike Allen talk about BMR, Mike doesn't talk about using it in transition cows. Okay? And here's 2 of his studies where it was used in transition cows, and as you can see, there's not an effect there. right? And so I can see why Mike would say that. Some things to keep in mind here, I think, which might potentially have influenced this response. This study was about 25% starch, and real often with the Michigan State diets, there's often high moisture corn in there. This one's half high moisture corn, half cornmeal. Just the study with Ying that we looked at previously also had high moisture corn in it as well. And potentially, there's a potential for appropriate feedback. And any of you, again, referring to Mike Allen, that have heard him talk about his hepatic oxidation theory, and propionate potentially feeding back and affecting intake, that's a consideration. And I think that we'd want to have in this trial here, and we'll think about it some more as we move through this last trial. And with this trial, basically, I was in eastern New York, and there's a consultant I've got a lot of respect for there that referred back to that earlier Satter study that we saw. And he said, you know, we're doing this on farms. We're using BMR corn silage and transition cows, and I really believe those results. We believe we're getting this production response, the sustained response, even though the cows were staying on BMR in this field-type evaluation. So it wasn't really looking at it only in the transition. But it's kind of reminded me of this work, and so I contacted Mycogen and said, basically, we're really interested at Cornell in trying to look at this. Would you be willing to fund this trial? And Mycogen said, yes, so we'll do that. And so we set it up at Cornell's TNR Center and tried to set it up really with that Larry Satter study in mind, where we're going to have now, it's conventional corn silage. This isn't a Michigan State where it's isogenic control. That was no longer available to us. So this is a dairy producer thinking, am I going to go with BMR corn silage, or am I going with a good quality corn silage type for cows variety? Right? That's what this comparison is. And we fed it then, as you can see here, for 3 weeks pre-fresh. Well, one difference though, since I don't see too many fresh groups going beyond that 3-week time period, once a week when cows were past 3 weeks in milk, so the average is going to be about 25 days in milk, they're switched to the common diet. Okay? So it's about 25 days in milk. They're going to be switched off of our treatment diet. Everyone goes on the same diet, and then we follow them out through week 15. All right? And so just keep in mind, this is the only difference here. This basically the 6 to 6.5 week time period. And in putting the diets together, the goal was to keep all parameters the same with the exception of NDF digestibility. And these diets were formulated with CPM dairy. 66 multiparous cows, just second greater lactation animals, were blocked by parity and randomly assigned to treatment or control diets. At Cornell, to get daily dry matter intakes, cows are in tie stalls, and there's these great big fiberglass tubs that their feed is put into, and it's put in with a data ranger that's weighed out as it's put in, and this data ranger comes by 24 hours later and vacuums it up and weighs everything that's left over. And that's how dry matter intakes are determined. FeedWatch was used in all ration preparation, which was helpful for me to go back and evaluate what cows truly were fed, and we'll discuss that in a bit as well, too. Cows were milked 3 times daily with weekly component sampling, blood sampled weekly during that transition period. So from about 3 weeks before freshening to 3 weeks after, just once per week, we took samples to look at NEFAs and BHBAs. Body weights and body condition scores measured about 5 times throughout the trial. The ingredients and TMR sampled weekly, and SAS used for the statistical analyses with previous lactation 305-ME being used as a significant covariate. And that's why it was included in our analyses. So, again, I'm going to go into more detail on this because anyone ever used BMR in transition cows and had it flop? Anybody? Anybody? Dan, you have? Okay, Corwin, you've seen it. Gardner? I have too. Matt? And I have too. And Lehman, I think you mentioned this earlier early in BMR days. Here's this brown corn silage. It's brown. It's ready to chop. It's 28% slop, and it's chopped fine. It's not mature, and that's what our fresh cows were getting. And I think that is one thing that potentially influenced these results. But I want to go over all these numbers with you so you're really familiar with what these corn silages were like and how this study was set up. The first one is Dr. Prokop, that we're just talking about having corn silage sit for a year before it's fed. So he's going to be happy here. Okay. So this corn silage is planted in 2005. The trial started in July of 06 and went through February of 07. So most of this corn silage was in the silo for a year when it was being fed. Now, that's one thing just to consider. Dry matter is thinking about where we want to be. Conventional corn silage is at 31.2%, and our BMR is just under 30%. Crude protein, this is what I typically see with BMR, is usually a little bit higher in crude protein than conventional. These fiber numbers are higher than what we typically, where are in central New York, where our corn silage typically is at. And that's where it came out, but probably basically with these dry matters. But as you can see, 44 and 45.5% NDF. Lignin, as Eb noted, that's the big difference between BMR and conventional corn silage. We're going to have a lower lignin level, and here it is just about 1 point lower. The soluble fiber is by Cumberland Valley, and that's by difference there. Our ash, very similar. Our total BFAs, as you can see, very similar. Lactate, acetate, all very similar, and pH very similar. Okay, so fiber levels here in terms of NDF and fermentation profile and overall dry matter, extremely similar between these two corn silages. Well, what's different? The big difference, again, going back to that lignin, there's 1 point, and NDFD. Instead of that about 12-point average, which I'm going to say as average with BMR versus conventional, here we're actually at 17 points. 56.8 versus 73.8% NDF digestibility. That's the Cumberland Valley 30-hour number there. All right, so that's one thing that's going to be different. Another one, and this is just kind of interest, and I'm throwing it out there so that we're all aware of it. I had Cumberland Valley, again, ran these numbers. These are their starch numbers running about September of 07, and the 7-hour in vitro starch digestibility. And at that time, we had a 28.5% starch in conventional and only 21.3 in the BMR, and basically the same level of starch digestibility. Well, I talked to someone who was very knowledgeable in this area and said you might want to recheck those starch digestibility numbers because I've been working with basically Cumberland Valley, and we've tried to make it so that this test is going to start detecting some differences because everything was so uniform. And so we did rerun it. And the first thing that happened actually, though, we actually dropped a little bit in starch in our conventional and went up 2 points in our BMR. So 26.2 and 23.5, and this is January of 09. Our in vitro starch digestibilities, as you can see, now both high, but both a little bit different. So a little bit greater starch digestibility in the conventional than the BMR, which kind of surprised me after a year of ensiling, actually, that we still saw a difference. I really thought things were going to be flat line there and the same. But that's where they were. Does this mean anything or not? I'm not sure. And we're going to come back again and look at this and how potentially this could influence results here too. Another one, again, just I think important one in terms of the results in this study, I particle sized a bunch of these different corn silage samples. So this is particle size over time. And with the Penn State particle separator used as directed in the paper, you guys. Okay? So what volume do we use when we use the Penn State particle separator? Right? It's according to the Lammer study, which is 1.4 plus or minus 0.5 liters of corn silage. And that's important, isn't it? It's actually 1.4. You better stick right with that because 1.4 minus 0.5, right, 0.9 to 1.9 liters of feed, you've got a huge difference in what you get in the Penn State particle separator box, right? So this is 1.4 liters, and again, that's important. Don't forget that your stroke length and your cycle, your hertz, they're also important too, all right? So 17 centimeters, 66 hertz about. So that's what we're doing here. And using those criteria, we're at what looks like a pretty darn coarse corn silage. 40% on the top screen, 48% in the middle, and only 10 or 12% on the bottom. Now, one thing I'll say about this is longer but very uniformly chopped corn silage. We don't have lots of long, scraggly stuff that cows are refusing. This is very uniformly chopped corn silage. I also ran through the Z-Box, and Ev mentioned that, but that's just Minor Institute and Zeno's effort at working more to look at physically effective NDF. And here, as you can see, they're both within like 0.2 points of each other, 94.8, 95.1, something like that. So it's 95% of both corn silages retained on a 3.18 millimeter screen. So again, particle length-wise and dry matter-wise, our corn silages are, I think, about as identical as they could be. Pre-fresh diet design, basically, in any of these diets here, I want to try to emphasize our variable of interest. So we try to have a heavier corn silage diet, just under 50% dry matter here in our pre-fresh cows, some haylage, 18% wheat straw, so a little over 5 pounds of wheat straw was in these diets. The cornmeal varies here because, as you remember, the starch level was lower in the BMR, so we're trying to keep our starch levels the same in these diets. And then the other thing that's a little bit different about these diets, both pre and post-fresh, have more fermentable fiber there than what we sometimes have. Again, I was just thinking some about that Michigan State work, and I did not want to have a high-starch diet and potentially have a propionate issue with intake. And so that is the reason we've got some more fermentable fiber here. The soybean meal, for example, the difference there is because of the crude protein difference between these two, but on a metabolizable protein level, we tried to make both of these diets the same. I'm going to point out here, too, there's some biochlor. People often ask about that. We've got a difference there. We'll come back to that. We've got the same level of yeast culture, smartamine, and rumensin in these diets as well. So spec-wise, this would have been right around 44% dry matter for both our dry close conventional and dry close BMR, and our formulated and the analyzed values were very close to where we wanted them to be. For example, the NDF was 44 and 44.5 to 45, so pretty much right where I wanted it to be there. Starch levels were a little bit lower than where we had planned. This is formulated, and the parentheses are the analyzed values. And finally, just on an NEL basis, just for your reference point, this is where the diets came out when everything was said and done, 0.67 and 0.68 NEL. That's per pound, of course, in these pre-fresh diets. On the minerals, again, the reason the BioChlor was there was that the Cornell's herd was using it at a low level already, and I had just left some there, but I needed to try to make my DCAD the same based on our preliminary measurements of our corn silages. And so that's why it was there. And basically, when it was all said and done, though, I shouldn't have used it because our potassium came out to be exactly the same. It made for a slight difference in our DCAD then, where our dry close conventional was 3.2 and our dry close BMR was 0.25. So about a 3-point difference in our DCAD levels between the two diets. Fresh cow diets, again, trying to emphasize the corn silage, so it's around 40% corn silage, otherwise pretty basic, or approximately 15% haylage, some wheat straw, corn meal, no high moisture corn, some fermentable fiber and sugar sources there with citrus pulp, fermentable fiber, of course, with our soy hulls pellets. Otherwise, our protein supplementation, trying to keep that very similar there as well. And finally now, this is week 3.5 on, week 3.5 to 15. And just to give you an idea what that was, I'm sorry, this is still a fresh cow diet. 17% crude protein, just under 20 ADF and 32 NDF. Starches, 22 are fresh conventional and 20% starch on our fresh BMR. Those are our analyzed values, again, when it's all said and done here. Otherwise, things very, very similar there. So a 2-point difference in starch between fresh conventional and fresh BMR. The common lactating cow diet now was this is 32% corn silage, 21 haylage, cornmeal, etc., and just pretty standard specs. Starch in that, I'm going to say 22 to 24% area for starch for the TMR. All right, so now we're going to start looking at some results. And first looking at transition cow health disorders here. Cows that received the conventional corn silage, we had 5 out of 33 RPs, had 1 in the BMR group. Had 3 cases that our TNR crew said had metritis, need to be treated for metritis, none in the BMR. As you can see, 1 ketosis versus ketosis with diarrhea. We had 2 of those in the BMR group. Mastitis events during this transition period, approximately the same, 3 or 2 events. And I used a Fisher exact test on a 2-sided basis, meaning we're not sure which one would be better, so we need to look at it both ways there. And looking at the number of these health events here, in terms of trying to look at it for a statistical difference, that would be a p-value of 0.09. So we could say that there is a trend for a reduction in metabolic disorders with cows when cows were fed BMR corn silage during this transition period. Mastitis events from week 7 to 15, we have about 7 in our conventional group and 4 in our cows that had been fed the BMR corn silage. Just a note, production and intake results were dropped during mastitis events for week 6 to 15 during that time period when that health event occurred. Anything during the treatment time period, though, if they had mastitis, all that information stayed there and was not altered in the data set. These are our intakes as cows moved through this trial here of our BMR in dark blue here and our control corn silage cows in fuchsia. And you can see for this first week in the pre-fresh time period when they're on the diet, they're completely on top of each other. Then we've got to have our control cows coming down, our BMR cows staying up there for another week before they start to come down. Post-freshening, obviously the BMR cows are above the conventional cows. It's going to be day 25 when they're going on that common diet, and you can see within a week or so, they're pretty much at the same level of intake. So it comes together fairly quickly after they're on the same diet. Statistically, that 2 weeks before freshening, cows fed BMR ate a little over 1 kilo more intake than the control cows, and that is significant. And the first 3 weeks of lactation, there's 2 kilos more intake, and that is very highly significant. Okay, so here's some of our real results here, and things for us to be thinking about, and why we're going to be seeing some of the responses that we did see here now. There's our intake, and that's a biggie. On production then, remember in that Larry Satter study, it was 4 to 5 weeks, and they had production through week 15. And here's where they were fed BMR through week 3.5. It's right here. And now at this point, they're on the same diet, and this is our production level lasting through week 15. These last 3 weeks, this is 3 kilos on week 13, 14, and 15, 3 kilo difference. So it's a 3 kilo difference of 3.5% fat-corrected milk for the entire 15-week time period, and it's a p-value of 0.067 on that. Again, 33 cows per treatment here. So I think that's pretty interesting, again, there. Looking at, just briefly looking at these different numbers that we've got here, our absolute production, 43.1 and 45.4, 0.069. Our fat-corrected milk we just saw. Our energy-corrected milk, similar levels with p-value of 0.08. Components, fat, not statistically different. Our fat yield, though, we've got an increase in the BMR group, or this trend here. True protein percent or yield, no difference. Lactose percent, not significantly higher, only numerically higher. But you put together some of these numeric increases along with the increase in yield, and we actually had a solids yield response of 5.67 versus 5.32 kilos with a p-value of 0.015 on that one. And that's for that whole, again, that whole 15-week time period here. So a highly significant increase in solids yields. Intake, you really saw the upshot of it already, but the one part to add on there is the feed efficiency for the entire study between our conventional BMR cows, both pretty much right at 2, and obviously no difference at all in that measure there. On body weight, body condition scores, I mean, our body weight's going to have been more identical, 1 kilo difference. On body condition scores, this is at the end of the trial, but at the beginning they didn't differ at all, so 2.9 average body condition score there. Kind of interesting here, I think. Remember we had our Fisher exact test with our metabolic disorders at 0.09 on the BMR cows, and looking at Semitic cell and linear score, this is average for the 15 weeks, 149 in the BMR and 323 in the conventional, with this interesting trend here. Linear score, 2.1, 2.6, 0.11. If we look at that graphically, we can see where the BMR cows are lower in linear scores all the way out through, finally it's week 12 here where they've really come together. There's not an interaction of treatment by time here, and I thought at first, I was surprised it wasn't until I looked more at these error bars. These error bars are really going to completely overlap, and that's probably why we didn't have any difference there. But to me, it's just kind of some interesting little potential trends coming here on the health side, and I'll come to you some more on that one. I stepped ahead of myself here. Let me hold off on that a little bit more here. NEFAs, no difference in NEFAs, pre or post freshening, and no difference in BHBAs post-freshening in these cows either. One thing about this, so it might be that there's absolutely no difference, and that's the way that's the data set. We only took these blood samples once a week, and sometimes when people they're really working on transition cows, and you're really trying to look at NEFAs and BHBAs, it's actually about every 2 to 3 days you're sampling these cows as they're moving through transition, because these things are changing very, very quickly. Here's our NEFA levels going from our week before freshening to our week after, or week of, I guess we've got here. And so the tighter you can try to take these samples, more likely you are to potentially pick up a difference. But anyway, that's one consideration. I went to FeedWatch, and I looked every 4 days what cows actually had been fed. So I looked at their mixed diet here. And then I used our monthly composites of our forages. Okay? And so by month then, I put together what cows really were fed in terms of ration prepared, and then what those forage analyses were. And I used that in CPM to create a predicted NEL for each of those comps. and then use that to calculate the energy balance of these animals, looking at them compared to as a percentage of NRC. And here in this pre-fresh group here, we've got for the whole pre-fresh time period, again, compared to NRC, we're at 163.5% of NRC. Control is 150% of NRC, and that's this p-value 0.04. So cows were in a more positive energy balance in this pre-fresh time period. Post-freshening, as you can see, they're completely on top of each other. And there's 91.4% of NRC, 88.1, and obviously there's no difference there. I was looking at these numbers just last night, and I was thinking, man, that is high. That's more energy than what I really thought these cows were getting. But again, it's an NEL 0.67 to 0.68 with really good intakes. And that's what led to this level here. Again, in the BMR cows, we're at 170% of NRC. And finally, that week before freshening, they're at 150%. Versus our control cows, as you can see, they're lower. Let's go right back. I'll show you exactly what. So on average, for example, the 2 weeks before freshening, we've got 13.2 and 14.3. And the full 3-week time period is 13.8 and 14.6. Okay? Anyway, I'm thinking what happened here with some of these things where we've got an apparent immune response or reduction, or trend to reduction in linear score, or trend for reduction in some metabolic disorders. I'm thinking that it's relating to this right here, where we had basically, I don't think they needed to be 170%, but in this time period right here, maybe there's benefit by being able to keep intakes up like they stayed up in this study here. Just to think some more about these intakes here, what's going on? What happened right here? And I think we've got a few things just to go over. Dr. Weber, was it because of Balcor? We've got 0.15 pounds versus 0.38 pounds. Does that give them that extra intake there? I don't think so. That's the answer, no. Okay? So that's the difference, and so I want to point that out. But I do not think that gave that kind of intake at all. It's because of DCAD. We got 3.2 versus 0.25. Did that give them that extra intake? And I'm going to say no, that didn't do it. Is it fermentable starch and propionate? Is it potentially that the control cows had that slightly higher starch, and it's more fermentable starch if we're going by these 7-hour starch numbers? Okay, so that's kind of a guesstimate. But let's say we are. If that's the case, I just plugged those numbers in and looked at, again, estimated how much starch we would have had ferment in our pre-fresh diets. It's 2.9 versus 2.7 pounds in the pre-fresh period, or 3.55 and 3.3 in the post-fresh period. So is that the reason why? I think 0.2 pounds of starch made that difference? No way. Is it 30-hour NDFD of 56.8 versus 73.8? That's 3.5 pounds of fermentable NDF versus 4.8. And I'm going to say, I really think so. I really think that's what did it. And what I'm curious of, you guys, is if in our industry right now, we've got group intakes of the pre-fresh group, but we never have this intake right here, right? We never have daily dry matter intakes of our cows as they're moving through transition. And what I wonder is if we've got a lot of our cows on our high-starch diets, we've got good overall group intakes, but that last 10 days before freshening, we're compromising intakes in these animals, and potentially we're compromising some production then after freshening in these animals as well. Okay, so I think that's just one thing to be considering here about this trial. That's interesting. In conclusion here, our cows fed BMR corn silage during the transition period. They ate more feed during this time period and produced more milk and milk solids for the first 105 days of milk than cows fed conventional corn silage. The enhanced intake during the transition period may have been due to less of a fill limitation in the BMR fed cows. That to me is the most logical event of what's going on there. Is that at 45% NDF in these cows, we're having some fill limitation that final 2 weeks of freshening, and cows that were fed BMR, which is digesting more quickly, allowing a greater rumen passage rate, and now more feed to be consumed by those animals. So I think that's what's happening there. Does this make sense? We're going to take our least digestible fiber source with our most digestible forage fiber source, and we're going to mix them together, right? Does that make sense? Why don't we just take our middle of the road fiber source and say, let's not mess with all this junk, right? Well, I wonder, though, by doing this, I wonder if we potentially accomplish some things like having farther off some control of our energy intake, and as we're moving closer to freshening, and now moving through freshening, having a room and mat and room and fill that's there post-freshening to help us out with intake post-freshening, to have some rumen ingesta there to potentially buffer some acids that are produced as a cow goes on that fresh cow diet too. I think there could be, I think there are benefits too, is what I'm saying. And I think that we probably do need to be thinking about looking more at that. The reason for the persistent increase in production in the BMR cows after cessation of BMR feeding during the transition is unclear because, for example, we didn't do milk secretory tissue biopsies to try to look at that. We certainly didn't do anything like that. But we have an improved metabolic status. It wasn't evident from NEFAs or BHBA, but it is evident from our prepartum calculated energy balance. And again, potentially that improvement in energy balance, its effect on immunity, helping cows through that transition better. More milk secretory tissue. The reason cows go up in milk production like this, the main reason, we've got more milk secretory cells being recruited there in that udder. And we have milk secretory cells that now are producing more and more milk. If we have cows that come through our transition better, we have potential for more milk secretory tissue and milk secretory tissue that is producing more milk. And that's what I'm suspicious of was happening here. One issue with this, which Ev in particular alluded to earlier, Minor Institute going maybe to 100% BMR corn silage because they've got the land base. We've got all kinds of our producers that don't have the land base to go all BMR corn silage, right? No way can we take that potential risk of having a real adverse weather event that maybe caused a greater yield drag in our BMR corn silage when you were tight on forage inventories to begin with. And that was the real reason I was interested in this study, is that we've got a lot of those producers out there, and could we potentially now target this more digestible forage so it's only going to cows that maybe would benefit from it, we only fed it for a limited time period, and we're not having to put a large amount of our forage acreage at risk. Thinking about it economic-wise, and these are rough numbers. This number changes almost by the day, doesn't it? How much does it cost to plant an acre of corn silage? So let's take it as a rough estimate here. $400 per acre. And let's say with conventional corn silage, we get 20 tons as fed per acre. It costs us $20 per ton to grow that corn silage. And now let's take an increase in our BMR corn seed cost, and this is very conservative. It should not be that much. So this is high. Our 10% yield drag I took here, and Ev had 13% overall on average, and sometimes where it was less, but I used 10% there, so we're pretty darn close there. That's 18 tons. That's $25 per ton of BMR corn silage versus 20 conventional. In this study, we fed right around 15 pounds for 50 days. That's 750 pounds of dry matter, or 1 ton of as-fed corn silage, right? 1 ton of as-fed corn silage, or $5 more to take this approach with your transition cows, $5. In this study, it was 6.6 pounds of milk for the first 100 days, right? So 6 pounds of milk at 10 cents a pound, 60 cents per day. And of course, we've got to take some feed out of there, but you see what I mean, 60 cents per day times 100 days, $60, right, for $5. I think there's some real, I think it's something really to look at and consider some more here. And so I persuasively convinced one producer I work with, let's do it, okay? Let's put it up. This is a 1,000-cow dairy, and we've had some success with BMR, but he wasn't ready to go the whole hog yet. And we put some bags up. And what, Lehman, you were saying if it's 30 below, it's not going to heat, right? If it's 30 below, what if it's 10 above? What if it's 10? Okay, what if it's 10 above, and how many of you have seen young boys around silage bags, right? I mean, it's hard for me to resist racing from one end to the other, or at least racing your son from one end to the other. And so that had been done on these bags, and this producer is not quite as aggressive as they should be as patching their holes. And I got to the dairy, and they said, this is a 1,000-cow dairy again, but we have 12 cows with ketosis today. Bill, we're not sure about this BMR stuff. We didn't have any ketosis before this BMR. We got 12 cows with ketosis today. And so, I talked about how crowded were the groups, and we ran out of feed. Any big group moves, stuff like that. And no, everything seemed to be in control there. We went out to the corn silage, and again, you can see it's pretty well encrusted in snow here. And they hadn't cleaned up the edges because it had been a really, really nasty day the day before. But I'd gone up and looked at it, and it's hot. And so that's my little compost thermometer there. And we're going to zoom. Now you can see some of the snow melting here on the face. And now you can see it's 125 degrees there. And that's a foot down from the top. In the middle, it's 125 degrees, and there's mold balls all throughout this stuff. Okay? So another thing I want you to take home today is that composted BMR corn silage is not better than conventional corn silage, you guys. Okay? That one's for sure. And this is going to be a challenge. If we have producers, again, they can't put all their acreage in it. We need to go with smaller storage structures. Everything that Lehman said about, man, we got to step up our management on bags, make sure we're on top of this, because we do get that air hole in there, and now we got bagged at its greatest density. Greatest density in the bag is average density for a bunker. So about 14.8 pounds is the greatest density in the bag. And then beyond that, up here, we are all in single digits. This is all single digits. And maybe you hit 12 pounds down here. This is where it's 14.8 way down here. But even down here where it's supposed to be 14.8, I had white mold balls, again, all throughout this stuff. So that's something we really have to watch for.